the main funder of EFF was a guy named John Gilmore, who is very, very liberal. He was one of the first employees at Sun Microsystems. And he was also the main funder of an open source project called GNU Radio. And what happened was the United States government paid very, very much money to one of these, they call them Beltway bandits, technology companies around the United States capital, to make a system that would receive any kind of radio so that we could spy on people. And, you know, of course, we have these agencies called the NSA and the CIA for doing that. And they had paid this corporation billions and billions of dollars, and it didn't work. So the United States spy infrastructure turned to the open source project GNU Radio, and then had to convince the ultra-liberal John Gilmore, funder of the EFF, that the government, the CIA, would pay for further development of GNU Radio. And so it did happen, and you may know it because if you have one of these dongles that you plug in to make a software-defined radio, the GNU radio software is one of the things that you run with it, and you can then receive anything you want, you know, be it television or radio. You just connect blocks together and it changes the frequency and the modulation, etc. So there are many, many strange bedfellows in the open source world. So I'm going to talk about security, and let's see, which one is forward? That's the one. So there's a big security problem. It's been a problem for most of my adult life, and that is that 70% of today's security issues are related to an attacker overrunning the boundaries of a memory buffer. So they send some input to a program on the web, and they send extra input, not expected, very carefully crafted. And through technical means, it is possible to take over the computer this way. So really big problem. And we have computer languages that solve this problem. One is called Rust. That's being incorporated into the Linux kernel development. So this problem will stop existing for new code in Linux. And my favorite programming language at the moment is Crystal, not to be confused with Crystal Reports, and also enforces memory boundaries. But so much of our code is in C and C++, and these things don't enforce those memory boundaries, and we can't afford to retrain all our programmers. We can't rewrite it, and they all have all these security problems. So we need a Plaster for computer security to provide memory boundary protection to all of those old programs that have scraped and bleeding security. It's got to work for C, C++, Fortran, all the other dinosaurs. Oh, yes. Is this turned on now? Yes, I keep walking away from the podium. Too much of a free spirit. So didn't we have a solution for this security problem? Yes, we had it in 1981. Intel released the IAPX 432, a different kind of CPU, which you've probably never had anything to do with, which included memory boundary protection hardware that, had it caught on, might have defeated 70% of today's security bugs. And they did this 40 years ago. It had tons of other innovations, many concerning security, things that we don't have in our computers today. This guy, Ken Shriff here, says, its architecture manual reads like alternate world science fiction. So what happened? to the whizzy new IAPX 432, it works slowly at 1/4 the speed of the IBM PC-AT, which was no speed demon itself. It was too ambitious for the technology and market of the time. Its features were implemented for Ada. Remember Ada? Nobody wanted to program in it. And the market rejected the speed and cost overhead. So the IAPX 432 became an economic failure and was discontinued by Intel in 1986. And now we could have used this on the internet. Some features lived on for a while in another processor called i960. In 1987, I went out and tried to solve this problem. I made a program called Electric Fence. This was a free program that put a hardware barrier at the end of every memory allocation by manipulating the virtual memory system. I was working for Pixar. We made movies. We didn't make memory debuggers. So it wasn't a business differentiator for Pixar, and I could afford to give it away to even Pixar's worst competitor. And so Electric Fence revealed innumerable bugs in operating system libraries and applications, but it was too inefficient to use in production. So I presented it as something to use only while debugging. So all of these internet security problems went on. 40 years later, the technology has finally gotten good enough that it makes economic sense to have hardware memory barriers in our CPUs. Okay, these things happen when they make economic sense, not when we can do them. The CPUs will run fast enough. It doesn't cost too much to use that many more transistors to implement this, and there's enough memory. So Monday, there was a meeting introducing a development board with a CPU with a hardware memory barrier system. And they recruited companies and institutions with C and C++ programs to test it upon. So now we have our Plaster for the biggest computer security problem on the internet today. And that's going to become more important. So the lesson here is we knew how to solve our worst security problem 40 years ago. Okay, we didn't do it when we became technically capable. Today, it finally makes economic sense to do it, but economics is not only about technical capability. So we're talking about open source. And since we're talking about open source, we have to talk about non-monetary economics, because mostly in the open source world, we see an exchange of work for a usable software product with some desired improvement. And it used to be that people were very confused about the economics of open source. How are you going to make open source, Bruce, and feed your family? And so 15 years ago, I saw that open source actually was working. And one of my colleagues at the time, Eric Raymond, had written a paper that posited that open source was a gift exchange based on people's leisure time. And that was actually true before companies got involved. But companies did get involved, and IBM was actually not very interested in a gift exchange, unless IBM was always the recipient. So 15 years ago, I explained the economics of open source in a paper, The Emerging Economic Paradigm of Open Source. And I know that many of you today are still challenged to explain how open source works, and you can find that paper online, and it will help you a whole lot. But so we have a work exchange instead of money in the open source world. We always have a motivation for that work. So access to great software is probably the strongest motivator. So our discussion of security economics needs to focus on motivation. What will people, companies, institutions be motivated to do? So Karen Sandler is a free software and open source evangelist and a lawyer. And Karen has an implanted heart pacemaker, a device electrically connected to her heart. She does a great speech on how the available pacemakers are externally accessible. There's a wireless device that the doctor can use to tweak the pacemaker, change its parameters, read its logs, and yet they have no security to speak of. And their software is opaque and trade secret, so you can't understand its problems, no less fix them. So here's this lady, and this is being put in her body. And it gives people on the outside the potential ability to turn off her heart wirelessly. Would Karen be helped by disclosed source code? So disclosed source code would need to grant some rights. And what I call disclosed source code, which I think I missed the slide, there it is source code without the rights that come with open source. And so you have the right to look at it and examine it and share your examination with other people, unless you want to restrict it only even more and only do that in a gated community. So that's what Microsoft does today. If you are a government, you can go to a room and you can look at the source code for Microsoft Windows in that room and see what the security problems are. And, I'm sure that they have fixed some and they have not fixed some, which the government knows about. And so that is what I call disclosed source code. It's also called a bunch of other things that are sort of euphemistic ways that people were trying to substitute this for open source. So it was public source or shared source. But the whole idea is that open source comes with rights, and these other things do not. So what if we disclosed critical code, like the code for Karen's pacemaker? And you could examine it, you could share your findings, but there would be no patent or copyright rights other than that. So you could not use it, you could not copy it, you could not modify it. It's still proprietary software. Would this help Karen with her pacemaker? Well, if you look at open source, most discovery of security flaws in open source is accidental. People discover them while working on the code. And the idea is, to work on the code, you have to develop an understanding of it. And there are many more such people working on code to do something productive than there ever could be deliberate security auditors. So the rights attached to open source actually provide a strong motivator for what I think of as general, undirected, often serendipitous looking over of the code and finding a security problem. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to deliberately search for a security problem. It takes tremendous focus and intravenous doses of coffee. And you can't ever finish. There's always going to be something that you can't see. So this idea of having many eyes actually makes sense, but you have to motivate those eyes to look at the code. And that's what open source does. So who would be motivated to look at this disclosed source code, this stuff that doesn't come with the rights? Well, bad guys are always motivated to look at code to do mayhem. They don't have the source for your Windows applications. They disassemble them. They've learned to read assembler. national actors are working to destabilize our society. This is a real threat. Don't discount it. They are running all of those robots on social networks. This is, as he says, Korea is a superpower, North Korea, and Russia as well in this regard. There are, of course, computer criminals of various sorts. Blackmail is very popular now. I've locked your computer, send me some Bitcoins. And also people just looking to count coup on others regardless of the harm done. And there's this sort of auxiliary of the real hackers called script kiddies. And the script kiddies get scripts on how to break things from someone else who's actually much more skilled. And they do it. And then, they go on their social networks and say, I own such a site. Okay, so there are lots of motivations for the bad guys to look at disclosed source code. What would motivate the good guys? Okay, so a lot of the motivations that exist for open source are missing in the case of disclosed code that doesn't grant significant rights. The problem is you can't do anything with that code. So pretty much the only remaining motivations are handouts, okay? They're bounties or research grants. And we can only afford to give so many handouts to security researchers. And go ask a security researcher, there's never enough. However, disclosed source code may still be very important because it may be all that we can convince current proprietary software companies to do. So I'll give you one example of something that just would not work as open source. So there wasn't ever a chance of motivating people outside of Boeing to develop the 737 MAX maneuvering characteristics augmentation system code. No one else would own a compatible aircraft. And what this did was, because of the shape that they made that aircraft with bigger, more powerful engines, it had a tendency to pull up. And so they had a software augmentation to pull it down. And unfortunately, had they actually disclosed this code and let researchers look at it, the researchers might have seen that the control authority, this is an aeronautical term, of the software was actually greater than that which the pilot had. So when the software pulled the airplane down, the pilot could not pull it back up. And 346 people died from this software bug. So that's a case where someone should be looking at this stuff. And yes, if that means we have disclosed source code and not open source, sometimes if that means you have to go to a special room to see it, this should still be happening. Let's look at another, the Volkswagen smog fraud. What happened was they made diesel cars and they could make the diesel cars perform really well, or they could make them comply with smog regulations, but not both. And as a result, they made software that when the car was attached to a dynamometer, this is when you put the drive wheel on a big roller so that you can rev up the car in gear and the wheels are spinning and the car isn't moving. And then you stick something in the exhaust pipe to measure for the smog in the exhaust. The car detected when that was happening and changed how it acted. So it complied with the smog regulations in a fake way while it was on this dynamometer. And then when you drove it out of the smog compliance station, it would go back to breaking the smog rules. And so who found this? not people who were looking for the problem. They were researching real-world conditions of diesel vehicles in order to improve government regulation. And they kept instrumenting these Volkswagens, both while they were driving them and while they were on the dynamometer, and they got radically different readouts. And they finally said, you know, something's really fishy here. So the whole point of this is you need motivation to work on something, to see its flaws. And nobody, until researchers looking for something totally different, saw the flaws in the Volkswagen, saw this tremendous act of fraud. You know, all these people have cars that don't work as well as they used to because now they have to comply with smog rules all the time. Okay, so open source isn't just sharing code. We actually have a whole lot of processes, and Amanda's going to talk about governance, I think. But from its first days, the good open source projects like Debian maintained a chain of custody for our code and identification of our developers using public key encryption. So we used to have key signing parties at conferences where we would meet, and one person would attest that they've seen someone else's identification and would sign their public key. So we knew if anything bad was ever put in our system, we knew who to press charges upon. And so, you know, when people say open source has security problems, this is the kind of thing you can talk about. We actually have processes to keep that from happening. And for the most part, if something is inserted into the download site or something, we find out in hours. But this isn't enough for truly life-critical code like Karen's pacemaker. So life-critical code needs audited releases. You don't want just anyone checking in code to Karen's pacemaker. Open hardware medical devices are real, though. If you go to South Korea, there's this guy who makes prosthetic limbs, and they're open source because people couldn't afford the prosthetic limbs from the medical manufacturers. And you know, all the same, people in other countries might not be able to afford a pacemaker from Medtronic, which is one of the major companies that makes them. An audited open source release would have an extra layer of scrutiny attached, and periodically new audited releases could be made from community releases. This isn't anything new. Most software projects do it when they make a release. It's only the level of scrutiny that changes when something is life critical. So where are we going? You know, how are we going to solve all of these security problems that are facing us? Okay, we now have the answer to 70%, but the other percent are going to get much, much bigger now. And a whole lot of our problems are in hardware. So if you look at computers, we are using the same computer architecture today that we were using in 1960. What changed? The words got wider, okay? We went from 8 bits to 16 to 32 to 64. The computer got faster, and it has more memory. And now we have parallelism because we couldn't make things any faster, so we now shove more of them in the same box. And we still haven't figured out how to program for parallelism for the most part. I mean, it's easy for me working at a place like Pixar because there are 24 frames in a second of animation. I can give one to each CPU, but most problems aren't solved that easily. So we've been using the same computers since 1960, essentially. And there's room for a lot of changes in hardware now. We tolerate a lot of problems, with our hardware, and our technical capabilities have now made it economical to fix some of them. For example, this is the one that makes me crazy. Our mathematical system in our CPUs is called floating point. It's actually called IEEE 488. I think it's a standard. It's existed for 40 years. It is not able to divide 1 by 3 and give an exact answer. You know, you get 0.3 with a whole bunch of 3s after it. And it's time for something better than that. And, you know, mathematicians can talk more about this than I do. Better limits on memory boundaries are an important security change to make now. I think that everyone's going to be able to make them because Intel did that work 40 years ago, and much of it could not be patented because of that. So these are some of the changes that we should insist upon. And why are they going to happen? Well, for 40 years, the manufacture of CPUs has been the exclusive domain of wealthy corporations. They were motivated to make their existing products bigger and faster, not different. Intel lost big every time they tried to technically innovate because the mass market didn't go along and they couldn't serve any smaller market. So the IAPX 432 failed, Itanium failed, etc. There's something called the gate array, which has changed the game because anyone with the necessary knowledge can now make a CPU that runs inside a gate array and test it, and then can have this manufactured relatively cheaply. I mean, relatively cheaply, maybe $1 million production run, but you know, we're talking about $1 billion if it's ARM or Intel. So thus we start to see open source CPUs like RISC-V. The reduction in the cost of entry is a really, really important thing in hardware today. Open source hardware development becomes practical because of it. And not only for things like CPUs. I have a friend, he runs a company called Applied Ion Systems. Just one person, he's a young physicist. He works on evenings and weekends. He has a day job. He does this in his basement of his home, funded out of pocket. Because he has access to specialized 3D printing and computer-assisted manufacturing from a company called Xometry, he successfully makes electric thrusters. Those are rocket engines for satellites. These things have been launched into space. They come from this guy's basement. He makes them as open source. Okay, so open source has a space program. It now actually has about 6 space programs. And so open source will drive CPU innovation because CPUs can be tested inexpensively and manufactured at relatively low cost. Hardware designers are going to be able to leverage each other's open source work, as with RISC-V. And I'll give you a parallel example. When I quit Pixar, I walked into Steve Jobs' office and I said, "You still don't buy this open source stuff." And Steve said to me, "Well, you know, I've had a lot to do with developing 2 of the world's 3 big operating systems, and each one took $1 billion laboratory to develop. So I don't think you're going to make it with this open source stuff." And shook Steve's hand, left the company, and never heard from Steve again. And but a year later, 1 year, Steve stands on the stage at Macworld introducing the Safari web browser, which was based on the open source KDE project. And Steve is standing in front of this big slide that says, "Open source, we love it." So I won that argument. Steve, of course, never acknowledged it. And so this is going to happen for CPUs as well. It will not take the $1 billion research laboratory. But if you're like Intel, you still have to make very large numbers to break even. And this is true also for ARM if they're trying to make the absolute highest performance chip, as Intel and ARM are, but not otherwise. If you can tolerate a somewhat slower CPU, you can make weird instructions and sell them to a small market that wants weird instructions and make money. Okay, so government can get in the way. I love that I'm talking at these guys here because they actually talk to the UK government and may get some sense into them, which I'm still trying to get into the United States FCC. One problem we're facing is Wi-Fi modules that are pre-approved by regulators like FCC and maybe Ofcom. I don't know if they do this. Pre-approved wireless modules are really attractive to computer manufacturers because if you use them, FCC doesn't have to approve your whole computer. The wireless part is already approved. So many computer manufacturers are incorporating these into new computers. The software on the Wi-Fi modules is locked down. It is required by the regulator as part of their regulatory approval. The code is expected to enforce the regulator's wireless rules. Unfortunately, these modules are made only good enough to sell. They have lots of security and performance problems, and we aren't allowed to fix them. Okay, so this is how your government can actually get in the way of security. So open source will continue to be the leader for security. First of all, you know, this is only a little part of open source, but the ability to read the code will remain an important element of trust. With open source, then, the motivations line up so that more people are likely to find and fix the security issues. So first you can read it, then you have a reason to work with it. Disclosed source code isn't going to work as well. It is going to have an increasing role. It's the only logical thing for things like the 737. But you can't motivate as many people to find the problems of disclosed source code because only its owner can fix them, and no one else has much of a productive reason to work with that code. So let's get to what are you doing to help with computer security. Every one of your companies depends on open source. If you don't think so, have me come in, I will find it for you. And many companies have taken a resource extraction approach to open source as if they were logging trees or drilling for oil. They profit greatly from its use, but they don't contribute to its development or maintenance. And how do they tell me, because I'm a strategic consultant, how they support open source? We support open source by being a paid member of the Linux Foundation. Well, most open source projects never see support from the Linux Foundation and similar organizations. Open source developers aren't represented on the executive board of the Linux Foundation, only big companies. And, you know, so it's working for the big company interest. And remember, these are the guys who treat open source as if they were logging for trees or drilling for oil. Talk with the open source projects that you use. Help them directly, okay? That is, you put an engineer on the project, you financially sponsor one of their own developers, you provide them resources. There are so many ways to do this. Now, more, how does your company support open source? Well, we pay Red Hat for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. We pay Tidelift. We pay IBM. Most open source projects never see support from these companies. And my favorite one is the OpenSSL issue. Okay, when a company says they have bank-level security, that means they're using OpenSSL. Okay, it doesn't mean that they paid RSA for bank level security. And hundreds of billions of dollars of industry security, every commercial website in the world essentially, was resting on the work of one guy. His name is Ben Laurie, and he wasn't getting paid by anyone. Well, that got fixed, but it still exists at the open source project that you depend upon. So get to know the open source projects you depend upon, support them directly. You can email me, you can even call me on the phone. It actually happens. So Bruce Perens, if you speak Latin, it means traveling Bruce. Thanks very much.